Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Hidden Harms, Criminalizing Reproductive Health. Today, we'll be examining the intersection of software that schools use to monitor students' online activity with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Today's presentation is the fourth and final installment in a series covering the harms posed by student activity monitoring software to marginalized groups of students. The remaining sessions occurred earlier this fall and detailed the harms posed to students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and the increased harms from contact with law enforcement. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We'll be recording today's webinar and it will be live streamed on YouTube. The recording will be shared those who have RSVP'd and will also be made publicly available at CDT.org. As I mentioned, today's webinar is being live streamed, so any questions we receive, we may read live. The last portion of the webinar today will feature an audience Q&A session, and participants can and should join the conversation. There's a few ways you can do this. One is by using the Q&A feature built into Zoom to submit questions. Alternatively, you may submit email questions at questions@cdt.org or on Twitter at #CDTquestions or by replying to @SendDemTech. Lastly, we ask that you keep yourself on mute during the course of the presentation. I am pleased to be joined by my esteemed colleague, Jake Laperruque. We are unfortunately not being joined today by Alejandra Caraballo, who is a clinical instructor at Harvard Law School's Cyberlaw clinic. Alejandra was invited to testify before Congress this afternoon, and though I can't blame her for making the choice she did, we do miss her sorely. That said, we are in great hands with Jake. Jake is the Deputy Director of CDT's Security and Surveillance Project. Prior to joining CDT, Jake worked as a senior counsel at the Constitution Project at the Project on Government Oversight. He also previously served as a program fellow at the Open Technology Institute and a law clerk on the Senate Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law. Jake, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Cody, for having me for this important discussion. So my work kind of deals with all things surveillance and government monitoring and kind of protecting your privacy rights in the wake of that surveillance. So that could be everything from, massive dragnet programs run by the NSA on a global scale to what is the latest tech on the belt of a police officer walking down the street that could be used to monitor. It's a very wide range of what we look into to try to protect individual privacy. And over the last 6 months or so, reproductive health privacy and privacy stemming from criminalization of abortion has been a very big priority for us. Needless to say, the Dobbs decision was a real landmark shift in our legal structures. And I think, one of not too many instances where suddenly an activity that the majority of Americans think should be legal is in many places criminal and can be subject to prosecution, to investigation, and to presumably very invasive surveillance. So we've been working on this in a number of areas. We're focusing on how potentially to stop federal surveillance and investigative aid from being used for abortion surveillance. This is an area where the administration has been vocally supportive of reproductive rights. So we think if that's the case, they shouldn't be sending FBI powers, DHS powers, all kinds of surveillance powers from these agencies to potentially help local police investigate reproductive health choices. Another area we're looking at is the idea of, at the state level, blocking statutes, types of laws that would prohibit companies and limit local judges and law enforcement from in any way helping abortion investigations that cross state lines and demands for communications, for location data, for other types of sensitive user information that could be used to prosecute abortions. That idea is a law that's already passed in California that happened this fall, and we expect that a number of other states that are very strongly protective of reproductive health rights are going to follow suit in the next year or two and pass similar laws as well. So that's our main focus here. But obviously, we're looking at this area, this new issue in a bunch of areas, including what we're talking about today, student health and privacy.
Excellent. And as Jake previewed, today's focus will be on the intersection of the software that schools use to monitor student activity online with the Dobbs decision. I am part of CDT's Equity and Civic Technology team, which, in addition to focusing on governmental use of personal information, also focuses on data use in K-12 schools. Our agenda today includes the following: examining the intersection that Jake addressed, which is the monitoring software utilized by schools, and the Supreme Court's recent decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade and the federal right to an abortion. We'll also be identifying recommendations for policymakers to address the privacy harms that stem from that intersection. And lastly, but certainly not least importantly, we'll be hosting an interactive dialogue with you about this important topic. The harms we'll be discussing today are not merely hypothetical. CDT conducted surveys in the late spring and early summer this year with students, parents, and teachers to better understand how student activity monitoring software affects students, teachers, and the education system. Student activity monitoring software is any technology that tracks students' activity online, such as dates and times of logins to systems, the contents of students' screens, or the contents of their emails, chats, or search and browsing history. Student activity monitoring may also enable real-time visibility into what students are looking at on their computers, and it can occur within a learning management system or through a separate dedicated piece of software. Our research found that student activity monitoring software invades students' privacy, chills their access to critical resources, and disproportionately harms marginalized groups of students. Those findings were detailed in our report, Hidden Harms, which we released this past August, and in 4 follow-on briefs released in October, November, and today. So let's explore how student activity monitoring software affects students in a post-Roe v. Wade world. In June 2022, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, overturning the federally protected right to obtain an abortion once guaranteed by Roe v. Wade. The majority opinion was suspicious not just of the constitutional right to reproductive health care, but also to privacy more generally. This was underscored by Justice Thomas's concurrence, was also a key component of the majority's reasoning. The majority stated, "We hold that Roe and Casey must be overturned. The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision, including the one in which the defenders of Roe and Casey now chiefly rely, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment." The majority opinion then went on to state, Roe, however, was remarkably loose in its treatment of the constitutional text. It held that the abortion right, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, is part of a right to privacy, which is also not mentioned. As the majority opinion suggests, Roe was not just about abortion, but also about privacy. And its conception of privacy and autonomy protected students and minors, including their confidentiality in reproductive healthcare decisions and regarding their sexual orientation and gender identity. Those confidentiality protections now lack a strong constitutional foundation. After the overturning of Roe, as Jake mentioned, states began to quickly criminalize access to reproductive health care. With the legal matter returned to states, policymakers have begun enacting and enforcing laws regarding reproductive health, including criminalizing abortions. The overturning of Roe made it possible for law enforcement to request data about abortions and reproductive health care on a constitutional level, which, as we will see next, is enabled by student activity monitoring. Jake, what are the implications of the majority's reasoning in Dobbs for reproductive health care and privacy? What role does digital surveillance play in the degradation of those privacy rights?
Thanks. So I think there's kind of two important separate aspects to talk about for this. First is kind of how we think about privacy in these different contexts. And then second is just sort of what does it mean for the surveillance specific aspect of privacy? As you mentioned, the opinion kind of leans on this idea. The word privacy is not in the Constitution. It's not mentioned. I think it's probably pretty universally understood that the Fourth Amendment is your right to privacy. It's a right from overly invasive searches and seizures. That is fairly different than the right to privacy as it's discussed in terms of reproductive health rights and a lot of other rights too. So you kind of, on the one hand, have privacy rights from surveillance of, maybe the government has a legitimate reason to invade privacy, but the Fourth Amendment says you have to do it at scale. So, let's say the police are investigating a bank robbery or a kidnapping. I think we will all agree that there's a decent reason for police to want to investigate things like that. What the Fourth Amendment says is you can't do so in an overly invasive or overly broad manner. You can't have generalized searches. You can't go up and down and look at every single person on a block's house or wiretap every phone. It has to be proportional and targeted. The idea of privacy in terms of reproductive health and a lot of other rights, such as rights to contraception, rights to marriage autonomy, are grounded in the idea that, as opposed to those situations I just mentioned where the government has a very good basis for invading people's privacy, but should do so in a targeted way, you have a right to privacy of, if the government doesn't have a legitimate reason to involve itself in your life, to interfere, then it can't do it. That was created through what's called a penumbral right to privacy in terms of the right that previously existed under Roe, and that still exists in terms of things like contraception. It's also been staked out through the 14th Amendment's substantive due process rights for things like marriage autonomy. So in the first level, that it was a huge blow to this notion that the government can't interfere in your private life if you're doing things that aren't going to affect others. It really cut back against that. There's a lot of concern of that, that might extend to those other private rights, such as marriage autonomy, contraception. That's why Congress passed a law just recently creating a marriage equality right, and why there's a lot of discussion right now of risk to contraceptions, because people feel that might fall just the same way Roe did. So, in terms of privacy and the idea of having your private autonomy in your life, I think it really did sort of open a Pandora's box of a lot of basic activities that we view that we take it for granted suddenly, are at risk, and reproductive health rights are now in many states gone. So second, in terms of the idea of the surveillance aspect, what this opened the door to was, reproductive health rights have been a common feature of society for a very long time, nearly 50 years, as a protection under Roe. And suddenly that has now become criminal in well over a dozen states, many more. It's in litigation, but we expect that either through new legislation or litigation proceeding, that it will become illegal there too. That opens up a huge amount of potential investigations into once legal and commonly accepted activity that's going to involve lots of surveillance, lots of investigating. And I think one key difference to think about is that when we look back to the time when abortion was illegal over 50 years ago in the 20th century, a lot of it was preventative, trying to stop doctors from engaging in these procedures, put pressure on them, push it into the margins of society in ways that it simply became inaccessible. Now, because medication abortion is so common, it is much, much harder to actually prevent individuals from seeking abortion care than it was previously. So there's probably going to be a lot more emphasis, as opposed to sort of the preventative, the leaning on doctors before the fact to not engage in procedures and catch them, to trying to criminalize and punish individuals that do receive these procedures or do receive medication, and use that as a deterrent. So I think, not only is it going to sort of revive this criminalization, this high level of investigative activity, it's probably going to become more common than before, because there's a lot less ability to prevent reproductive health choices than there were before. These states that want bans are going to have to focus more on punishment and trying to use that to deter activity.
Those are great points. I want to lift up that first point that you made, that the language of privacy that was celebrated in Roe and subsequent opinions was more than about compliance with data sharing and NDAs and things like that. Instead, it was really about autonomy, that there's a certain sphere of one's life where the government ought not to have a role in regulating or dictating key decisions. And those rights were extended, as Jake noted, not only to the right to marry someone of the same sex, but for mature minors, the right to make reproductive health care decisions, or a right to privacy in their gender identity or sexual orientation. And then Jake's second point, too, about the shifting emphasis toward enforcement against individuals really raises the concern how that might fall on individual students who are making a decision regarding the reproductive health care. And that's the second bullet you see on the slide here, which notes that student activity monitoring software is often trained to look for sexually explicit material, consequently making it possible that reproductive health information is already being collected and shared with law enforcement. Schools, law enforcement, and other authorities may even ask vendors to add keywords related to reproductive health. And we're going to turn to that nexus between law enforcement and student activity monitoring now. Because Dobbs permits the criminalization of reproductive care, we want to zoom in on student activity monitoring's relationship with law enforcement. As Jake noted, the overturning of Roe now provides law enforcement with reason to seek out data regarding students' reproductive health care. According to CDT's research, student activity monitoring may be providing that data directly to law enforcement. So what did our research find? First, our research, which again were polls of students, teachers, and parents on their experiences with student activity monitoring, suggests that contact with law enforcement is an intentional part of these systems' designs. Point number one that our research found is that the use of student activity monitoring software is widespread. 89% of the teachers that we surveyed report that their school monitors students on school-issued or personal devices. The second point is much of that monitoring occurs outside of school hours. Only 45% of teachers in our surveys report that student activity monitoring is limited to when school is in session. 37% of those teachers reported that their schools send alerts directly to law enforcement when they come up outside of school hours. 44% of teachers report that one or more students were contacted by law enforcement because of behaviors flagged by student activity monitoring software. So the key finding here is not only is student activity monitoring software widespread, but it is in fact directing data toward law enforcement, especially when when flags occur outside of school hours. And that is our final point on this particular slide. Monitoring outside school hours leads to increased contact with law enforcement. Of teachers who report that student activity monitoring is active outside of school hours, 53% indicate that they know students were contacted by law enforcement versus 36% of teachers who report that the monitoring is limited to only school hours. So the use of student activity monitoring software not only leads to increased contact with law enforcement, but that increase is even more pronounced when the monitoring is occurring outside of the school day. That contact with law enforcement is often built into these systems by intent. 78% of teachers whose schools use monitoring report that students at the school were flagged by monitoring for disciplinary action. 59% report that discipline occurred as a result. Of the teachers who use student activity or who report that the school uses student activity monitoring software, 70% report that its purpose is to identify violations of disciplinary policy, compared to less than a majority for identifying urgent needs for medical or safety interventions. And that is a key finding that teachers state that, generally speaking, that the point of student activity monitoring software is to enforce disciplinary violations. Finally, I want to pause and note that 29% of LGBTQ plus students report that they or someone they know has been outed by this technology, which reaches into, again, protected spheres of students' lives. So Jake, I'm going to turn to you again. As you look at this data on student activity monitoring and its relationship with law enforcement, what concerns come to mind? Why do students in the educational context raise particular concerns?
I think there's a few reasons to be concerned, especially in the student context. First, students have diminished rights to privacy compared to adults. I won't go into kind of the full level of case law and history there, especially because, as the exact topic we're talking about, Dobbs shows some of that case law, unfortunately, I think can be a lot more fluid, and we might not even be able to rely on precedent as much as we would hope. But generally in the past, the courts have held that while students, when it comes to their activities in schools, don't have zero rights to privacy, searching their lockers, their bags, things like that in school, it is often held to a lower standard than it is for, an adult. So it's especially concerning because students are uniquely vulnerable to law enforcement surveillance because of that. As a general principle, when you combine it with this type of technology that makes it so much easier, that risk gets amplified. Second, you've talked about kind of how the harms of this can fall on marginalized individuals more often. And that is something we see in a lot of other respects. Marginalized communities are more often subject to surveillance. Marginalized communities, often in the reproductive sphere, have a harder time finding safe and legal abortions. This was something that was true even before the Dobbs decision came down, and it will probably be amplified by it. Marginalized communities in the same way will often have less access to digital resources and electronic devices and might be more reliant on their school devices and systems to go through. So I think, it's worth thinking about that, an individual from, who's more affluent or better situated in whatever way might have an easier time, using their own computer at home, going online, outside of school, things like that, that individuals that are the very people that are going to be most vulnerable to surveillance, over policing, and limits to their reproductive health choices are going to be the ones that are probably going to be most reliant on this particular type of electronic and digital services that have these monitoring systems built in. Third, I think what I worry very much about is the idea of, we're talking mostly about the law enforcement surveillance context, but which is a very big concern. But beyond that, just the practical social aspects. One sort of common myth that we have to kick back in terms of the policy discussions around surveillance is people saying, well, what if I have nothing to hide? Now, there are a few reasons that privacy advocates like me very much blanch at that idea and think it's incorrect. One of them is the idea that, even if you don't have anything to hide in terms of committing illegal activity, having, the police investigate you for a crime that you should be, arrested for, there's a lot of activity there that you might want to hide because it could be, it still could have social stigma, it still could have not, criminal, but still real world consequences if that was revealed. Now, that's true in general, but that's especially true for children who are still under the care of parents. I mean, you mentioned the fact that student activity monitoring, that this software can out individuals. That's a severe harm to a person in general, but it's especially dangerous if we're talking about a minor who is still under the care of parents who might, not accept who they are in those choices and might actually punish them, kick them out of the house for something like that. That's true for status as an LGBTQ individual. That's also true for individuals that might be seeking certain reproductive healthcare choices, or individuals that are simply looking for information about healthy and safe sexual practices. Having this type of monitoring activity, even if an individual is just looking, how do I avoid getting pregnant because I'm in a state that bans abortion when I'm engaged in sexual activity, or, how do I get an abortion out of the state I'm in because it's illegal here? Those activities very well might not lead to any sort of law enforcement consequences. They're, as far as I know, legal in states even that have banned abortion. But if that's something that those individuals' parents or guardians found out, the student could face very real consequences for that. So I think these are all factors we really need to keep in mind for this.
Those are great points. And one of the key ones there is that minors are generally facing less robust privacy protections in many spaces, especially in the school context, where although those privacy protections are not eliminated, they're often reduced. And we want to take a look at some of those privacy protections now. Two of the primary laws that might help protect students' data regarding reproductive health care decisions are the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. Whereas FERPA applies to personally identifiable information from an education record, HIPAA applies to individually identifiable health information that's held by certain healthcare entities, such as a healthcare provider. However, neither of these laws are likely to provide sufficient protection to students from student activity monitoring in this particular case. Let's take a look first at FERPA and some of the reasons its protections come up short. FERPA does little to address student data that schools collect and gives schools broad flexibility in disclosing that data. For example, FERPA generally provides schools broad flexibility in sharing information with school officials, including technology contractors or even school resource officers, and in certain cases, law enforcement. FERPA also permits disclosures to law enforcement in connection or in compliance with a court order or subpoena, or in response to a health and safety emergency as determined by school officials' discretion. HIPAA similarly provides few protections for students. It does not likely apply to educational records covered by FERPA, and few schools are consequently subject to HIPAA's protections. Likewise, data collected from student activity monitoring, such as browsing history, are not medical records protected by HIPAA. And finally, HIPAA permits but does not necessarily require covered entities to respond to law enforcement demands. There's also a number of state laws, including 140 state student privacy laws, that may play a role here. But as Jake and I have been discussing, states have also taken efforts to curb students and teenagers' privacy rights in this space. So state law might provide additional protections or increase law enforcement access to student-sensitive information in this particular case. Jake, are there other policy or legal issues that give you concern regarding students' data on reproductive healthcare decisions?
Not me. I think that covers main areas. I mean, one thing I would just add as far as HIPAA, I think that the general conception of HIPAA is that it prevents sharing of medical information, and one weakness, as you've alluded to, that we like to hit on a lot is the fact that, well, so much information that can reveal medical status and choices is not covered as medical information within it. But even if records are within that domain, unfortunately, still, in the law enforcement context, it might stop commercial sharing or voluntary sharing of this information. But if, a doctor or, a school nurse or someone who has medical records receives a law enforcement order from them, HIPAA does not prevent sharing that information. It's still, they are still required to hand it over. So, even something like HIPAA, that for the field that it does the type of data it actually does cover, provide some protection in data privacy and commercial privacy context. It provides much less protection in the field of surveillance.
On that note, let's turn to potential recommendations for policymakers since current laws are inadequate to protect students and their privacy regarding reproductive health care decisions. CDT has advocated for reforms both at the federal level and at the district level. We have championed reform through a number of venues at the federal level, but I'm going to highlight two of particular salience here. One, we have asked for the Federal Communications Commission to clarify the monitoring requirement in a law known as the Children's Internet Protection Act. The Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA, is the law that governs the FCC's E-rate program, which provides funds to schools and school districts to provide broadband connections to classrooms. It was also key during the course of the pandemic for providing devices and connections to students during the course of remote learning. In interviews that CDT conducted with school district IT leaders, they stated that they believed that this sort of monitoring technology was required by CIPA. However, CIPA itself includes a disclaimer that says that it does not require the tracking of any identifiable minor or adult user. So we have asked both the Federal Communications Commission and Congress to clarify CIPA's monitoring requirement so that schools can operate knowing that this type of technology is not required because they receive funds under the E-rate program. We have also encouraged enforcers at the federal level to protect students' civil rights. This fall, a coalition called for the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education to issue a policy statement addressing student activity monitoring software and to commit to bringing enforcement actions for uses of student activity monitoring software that burden students' civil rights and civil liberties. In conjunction with that, CDT filed comments with the Department of Education, encouraging them to provide guidance and clarification under Title IX and the ways that student data is shared with law enforcement that may cause discriminatory effects for students seeking reproductive health care, or if that data sharing otherwise discloses their sexual orientation or gender identity. At the school district level, we have pursued a number of routes for school districts to help protect marginalized groups of students from student activity monitoring software. In the context of reproductive health, we have urged school districts to take on 4 efforts to help protect students' privacy and access to reproductive health care. First, they should minimize data sharing and collection. Schools should not proactively or automatically share student data regarding reproductive health care with law enforcement. Second, schools should be transparent with families and with students. If districts choose to use student activity monitoring, they should inform parents and students about the specific data collected and how it is used and shared. Third, schools must maintain control of student data. School districts should make explicit in their contracts with vendors that they, rather than vendors, have ultimate control of student data. They should also instruct vendors not to collect, retain, or share data related to students' reproductive health care. I used should for this particular bullet point because direct control of student data is a requirement under FERPA. Fourth, and finally, schools should build capacity within the school community to protect students. Schools should engage community members to monitor students' online activities and coach them on digital literacy and online citizenship, which can limit the unnecessary collection of data about students through the technological means that we've discussed here. Jake, are there particular policy efforts that you've uncovered in your work that you would like to see implemented to protect students' reproductive privacy?
I think overall this is an area where I defer to kind of the work and priorities that our civic tech team has really well laid out here. I think just kind of I would echo especially the point about minimizing data collection and sharing. That is always a very basic point in the surveillance context when we talk to private actors. And we've had a lot of inquiries since the depositions from large companies that may regularly work with law enforcement but are concerned about data being used in this way, to smaller companies that have very rarely, if ever, received law enforcement demands because it's just not the type of field that they've worked in that usually receive them. But now suddenly, because of criminalization of reproductive health choices, they feel that their information might be much more at risk of being demanded. A common thread we always say is step 1, consider what you're collecting and holding on to, because you can not be asked to hand over information that you do not hold. If you never collect it, if you promptly after collecting it and using it for limited purposes, you need it, delete it, and then you get a law enforcement demand later saying turn over this data, you cannot be legally obligated to hand over something you do not have. So that really, I think, is kind of the fundamental easiest answer, right? And we understand certainly there are many contexts that all types of private entities do need information and that it can very much benefit users for them to have it. But I think it really is, a great and important example of why the sort of default should be, don't collect unless we have a clear reason to.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great point. As we saw earlier, both FERPA and HIPAA, as well as many privacy laws, include an exception to their protections in case the school or the entity receives a demand from law enforcement. And Jake put it quite nicely when he said you can't hand over data that you don't have. And it is both schools' right and legal obligation to maintain that control of student data. And that includes instructing vendors on what not to collect, as well as when it should be destroyed. And they should take those measures into consideration here to protect student privacy. Jake and I are going to explore a few questions in dialogue regarding student privacy and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I want to encourage audience members to use that question and answer function to ask any questions they might have on this particular topic. And again, please use the question and answer function, and there are additional options here as well. So, Jake, one of the big concerns here, of course, is the harms that students might face due to this surveillance technology. How would you explain the potential harms that students might face to administrators who are trying to make decisions about what tech to use in their schools?
Well, and I think, as we discussed before, it is kind of that two-factor thing. I mean, first, probably the more severe risks to think about is actual risk of law enforcement investigation and activity. The consequences of that can be quite severe. And that's something where, I think administrators could find themselves between a real rock and a hard place of wanting to protect their students. But again, there's just, individuals, companies, actors have very little options if they receive a lawful government order, even if it's a law they don't like or support or think is reasonable, saying you have to hand over this data so we can investigate and arrest and prosecute this person. So again, I think, administrators that are sympathetic to students that care about their privacy in this context and their rights in this context would be well served to think that collecting less is probably the safer option, because, you don't really have the ability to just say, I don't think it's right to investigate this thing, so no, I will not be handing over this information that we hold. Second, beyond the law enforcement respect, I think is, as we mentioned before, the just kind of beyond the box of law enforcement and just into general society, that there are severe risks of, what if a student is in the care of parents or guardians that, do not support some of the choices and other aspects of a student that could be revealed by this type of software. And then that doesn't necessarily even mean reproductive health choices that are illegal. Again, if an individual is looking at potentially going to get an abortion out of state, in a state that's banned, if that's flagged in terms of active monitoring, that would not be a crime under any of these laws, but it's something that parents might still engage in some really harsh retribution against their child for. Same thing for just engaging in sexual activity and worrying about potentially get pregnant and not having the option to get reproductive health care. If that is revealed, that's something that parents, others in the community, peers, that there could be very severe social consequences for. So I think, it's worth thinking about in both those respects of, one, the actual law enforcement and legal risks that collecting this type of information can entail, and then second, how students are uniquely vulnerable to things that are still completely legal, but that they are far more vulnerable to social harms and consequences because of their status as minors.
Yeah, the fact that the harms extend beyond just legal jeopardy for the students is key. And there's also a certain way that the technology and the potential interface with law enforcement also impinges on relationships between students and teachers, students in the school, and students and their families, where this is a highly sensitive decision to be made. And instead, it's being put into the space of a algorithmic technology that's scanning chats and emails and being directed to law enforcement. So there's also this relational harm that's occurring as well.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that a little bit, because of the fact that it is automated, so much of the context can be lost. You can have discussions of fairly innocuous activities that are just in this realm or, in some way tangentially related to it, that still get flagged and still get pushed on, that, once again can reveal information about students and minors that is, not legal, not any sort of indication that they're doing something that is illicit or that is a danger to themselves, to others in any way, but still just gets pulled in because instead of being, a conversation with a teacher, something like that, where what they're asking or interested about is very clear, it's just a computer system that really doesn't often understand exactly what they're looking at, but just feels the need to push it on.
Yeah, in that same vein, it runs the risk of undermining trust that students and families have in schools. In our previous rounds of research, we found that parents and students who generally trust schools as safekeepers of student data. But however, if there are surprising uses of that data that they weren't informed about or didn't expect, it can undermine that trust in that relationship. So we've discussed some of the policy measures that we thought might be implemented at the federal level or at the school district level. Do you have any recommendations for what students or parents might do to protect their privacy?
I think kind of the initial aspect is to consider, I always say consider your threat factors. I think one reason we want strong privacy laws is just, as much as it's good to have safe practices for yourself, I don't think it's reasonable to ask individuals to, always think about this and always kind of be trying to protect themselves all the time, prevent data collection all the time. It's just, there's too much going on there. So I think, just to give yourself the reasonable amount of space of how much you can focus on something like this, think about what types of information is most important to you to keep private, both from just social preferences and individual concerns, and also from potentially the aspect of legal or social consequences. When you do that and figure out, okay, this is what I actually really care about keeping private. This is what, maybe I might keep private voluntarily, but if something happened to it is not that important to me. And that's all an individual choice. Think about ways you can segregate your data out or your activities from having data be collected. So, those more sensitive activities, more sensitive information, you might want to not be doing that on a school computer or device that has, is given by a school and has monitoring software on it. You might want to do that on a home device or go to a public location like a library to do that. Secondly, consider the types of software systems you're using. Browsers like Tor are more safe than commercial browsers that will track activities. End-to-end encrypted messaging platforms are more safe than ones where the activity is held by companies and can be handed over. There's a huge range here. And again, I think kind of the underlying principle is just I don't think we can reasonably expect people to either jump off the grid entirely or to know every specific way that their information can be collected and steps they would need to take to mitigate it. I would hope kind of this is an area where lawmakers can get out front and provide the protections that are needed. But to the extent that individuals want to do it, I think kind of, finding out what data you need to keep safe and then segregating your activities. And again, not just an individual conversation, but I mean, browsing, metadata, all these things can potentially be very revealing if the data is collected from it. So I think kind of computer and digital activity entirely, you'd want to be away from systems that collect excess data.
Those are great points, and those are great sort of pointers for individual protection. But I think your underlining point is true as well, as many of those are technically sophisticated and require some degree of resources that just aren't available to lots of other folks. And one of the things our research revealed was that students who are aware that they're being monitored self-police. And to some extent, you could say, well, that's them being smart about the systems that they're using. But unfortunately, what we found is it means that LGBTQ plus students with disabilities, students with mental health challenges are not seeking out resources that they need online because they know that it may trigger a flag on the school activity monitoring system. So although there are those tips that folks can take, Jake, I think your point's absolutely correct that there needs to be a more system-wide approach examining the privacy and equity implications that these are causing for students and families.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize in that, I'm sure it's that self-policing aspect is strongest for in-school programs and systems that have kind of this type of monitoring tech on them. But, I imagine it happens off of that too. I mean, there are many examples just in recent history of how surveillance, especially for marginalized communities, can have severe chilling effects in terms of what you say, who you interact with, and what you do. In that same vein of, we can't expect everyone to be a tech expert who understands everything about what systems are secure or exactly what data is being collected and how law enforcement has access to it. I think we can expect that individuals who are engaged in that self-policing are probably going to do it, in a overbroad manner, not overbroad in the sense of, it's a bad decision-making on them. I think it's probably reasonable decision-making given kind of the limited knowledge and the risks, but, might be kind of, even if systems are more safe, like ones at home or in a public sphere, like a library, things like that, might still kind of, I'm not sure if this could get traced back to me. I'm not sure if I could be outed in some way with this. So maybe I just, am better off not actually engaging at all.
Want to plug again for any audience members who might have questions, please feel free to jump in the Q&A and share any questions you might have. Jake, the research that we've talked about today is based on polls of students, teachers, and parents. What sort of question do you think we should ask in future research?
That's a very good question about questions. I would like to know about outside school accessibility. How often students have the ability to kind of, to, without using these types of devices, and outside of a school setting, have the ability to freely go online and pursue resources on their own. And again, as we've talked, kind of a recurring theme is sort of students might, who are vulnerable to this might not just be from a legal context, but from their parents. I would suspect that, students who worry that they could have private, intimate activities or aspects of their identity outed to parents that wouldn't accept that, probably also face monitoring risks at home in a similar manner. So I'd be very curious, kind of both accessibility in general, just like, do you have home computers? Do you have ready access to high-speed internet? And also, do you potentially in a home environment have an internet that is safe and private, or more safe and private than it is at school, because that might not be the case as well. So I'd be really curious to kind of understand that accessibility aspect for students. And yeah, I'd be curious kind of to what degree students are concerned about, legal ramifications of their activity and their data being handed over, what it might indicate about potentially illicit activity, and then the kind of various social ones, how much they care about their parents finding out about something, and how much they care about their peers and community finding out about something.
The note about accessibility is a very important one. As an organization, we have celebrated involving parents in decision making about data and technology, but it's important to recognize too that not every student has access to a safe home where the assumptions that we bring to the table about what a family might look like apply. And that's especially true of some of our most vulnerable students. Then the point too about accessibility in the sense of, do you have the technology, is such a vital one. In interviews we conducted with school IT leaders, many of them reported that they had higher proportions of low-income students relying on school-issued technology. This is critical because although some of this monitoring can take place on personal devices, the vast majority takes place on school-issued devices where schools and the technology they employ will have deeper access to the devices, accessories, and functions. So if you have a group of students who are more likely to rely on school-issued devices, they are likely subject to more surveillance as well. So that intersection between the equity consideration and the monitoring and surveillance is, I think, one that probably doesn't come to as a surprise to a lot of folks in this space. So one, I think this will probably be our closing question, unfortunately. One audience question that we have: are there any pieces of student data protection legislation in the works that you find promising at the local or state level? Are there any districts putting data privacy and protection in creative or notable ways? And Jake, I'll let you fight the hype a little bit, since I know student privacy is not your main forte, but if there's any legal reforms out there you see that could promise to help protect students and other folks in this space, love to know them.
Yeah, not to tangent off the question too much, because my focus is more on kind of surveillance laws that provide general protections as opposed to kind of particularized protections. I think we're looking at a lot of areas, everything from location privacy to facial recognition to browsing privacy, and just trying to kind of generally create better standards for that type of information. Right now there are not clear laws about what sort of standard the government needs to get your browsing data demanded from a company. There's a general requirement for a warrant to get location data, but there's a lot of open questions and loopholes to that. Most of them will be the fact that you can simply buy individuals, the government can buy individuals' location data from data brokers as opposed to getting a warrant for it. And then tools like facial recognition in particular, it really is largely a Wild West in terms of regulation. So there's a lot of areas where simply the technology has run ahead of the legal protections that I think individuals are entitled to, that hopefully, we can get that addressed on a general level. But, as we've said in this discussion, even if those general protections exist, quite often students don't reap the full benefits of them because of how their rights are sometimes limited or curtailed, and sometimes how they're subject to the type of compulsory monitoring that an adult wouldn't be.
And on the student privacy front, there are three that come to mind. One is, of course, state student privacy laws. And as I mentioned, there are 140-ish state student privacy laws on the books offering varying degrees of protections. One I do want to point out is the state of Minnesota did pass a law this past session specifically on student activity monitoring. The general purpose and thrust of the law was to limit the data collection to specific educational purposes. And so it was seeking to have that data minimization principle that we've discussed embodied into the law. So that's one worth checking out. It's brand new. It's untested at this point to see how it's enforced and implemented. A second one is the Title IX proceeding that's currently happening at the U.S. Department of Education. CDT filed comments in that proceeding, urging the Department of Education to use that opportunity to recognize that certain uses of technology, including student activity monitoring, will have disproportionate effects on groups of students who are protected by Title IX. That includes students who are pregnant, students who are trans or otherwise are gay, lesbian, or bi, and using Title IX's existing protections and extending them away to this sort of new technological surveillance that has disproportionate impacts on pregnant students or LGBTQ plus students. And the last one is fairly wonky, but there's been a long simmering proceeding at the U.S. Department of Education to rethink through some of the regulations under FERPA. And one that we had penned a blog post on is asking the department to update its conception of what is an education record. It's an unbelievably wonky take, but it's important that the scope of an education record, which determines the scope of FERPA, keeps up with the complex sorts of data that are being collected in the education space now. So that's something we hope the Department of Education will give serious attention to and think very closely. How does this 50-year-old law apply to modern data in a modern education system? It's a great audience question. We are down to our last few minutes here, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. You can find future CDT events at cdt.org/events. Feel free to follow us on Twitter at SendemTech as well to get the latest updates from the security and surveillance team, of which Jake is the deputy director, as well as the equity in civic technology team. Jake, where can folks follow you online, and what else is there anything else you'd like to plug?
I would plug just, all the work we're doing on surveillance, and in particular, reproductive health surveillance, which you can find on our website. We have a series on federal aid to, or limiting federal aid to abortion surveillance, and a coalition letter to the White House we just lit on that was signed by over 50 organizations. So it's a topic we're hopefully getting momentum on. Me and all my work, you can follow social on Twitter for, as long as that website is around, we will see. But yeah, I would especially just, echo you and encourage you to check out the site and all the great work, across the various teams we're doing there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jake. And thank you again to our audience members for joining us. We hope this was a helpful overview of the intersection of student activity monitoring software and the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court. This was our last in the series on hidden harms that I mentioned. The full series is available on CDT's YouTube page, and you can see the web address here. And finally, if you have any additional questions or comments, feel free to email the Civic Tech team at civictech@cdt.org. Thank you again, folks, and have a great afternoon.